Hello and welcome to the second season's 17th episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Sally Stone, reader and programme leader for the MA Architecture and Adaptive Reuse programme and director of the Continuity in Architecture Atelier at the Manchester School of Architecture, about her recent book, Inside Information, The Defining Concepts of Interior Design, which she co-wrote with Ed Hollis and which was published by Reba Books in 2022.
It is a sort of a plea for a return to that sense of interiors within buildings. And the idea that, Venturi talks a lot about that in Complexity and Contradiction, and that he has a sort of a plea for the idea that the interior and the exterior can be different. And the architecture as sort of the building, rather, as a mediator between the interior and the exterior. And so that the building is a container for something, and the interior then having an identity. And that identity changes depending on who's occupying it, depending on what the use is.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome again to Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Sally Stone. Sally, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you, Ambrose, for inviting me. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. I lecture at the Manchester School of Architecture, and in actual fact, Ambrose, I was your tutor, I think, when you were in either second or third year. So we are going back an awful long way.
So long. Third year. Project in Buxton.
Oh, in Buxton. Oh, yeah, that was a nice town and a good project. Yeah. So I used to run the Master of Architecture there, and I've just set up a new programme called MA Architecture and Adaptive Reuse.
So you're my second adaptive reuse person, so maybe we should go and talk about that a bit first. So what does that look like?
The programme, the new programme. Well, after running the MArch for so many years, when I stepped down, not that long ago now, there were 450 students on the programme. And this new one that I've just set up, because it was only ratified in May, it's got 11 students. So not only do I recognise them all, I know all their names, and it's wonderful. But what I quite like about it, it's not ARB regulated, so it doesn't have all those very careful and important criteria to it. So we can experiment a lot more and try out things without sort of worrying about exactly how it's going to stand up and exactly how the environmental control is going to work. So it becomes sort of very theoretical, very experimental. And although we're still in the first year, what I'm hoping is that it's going to attract people from a traditional architectural background. So I've been having conversations with developers, with fine artists, with a textile designer, all sorts of things like that. So I think it's going to prove to be really interesting and quite stimulating.
But what's the motivation behind it? Like, why adaptive reuse? I know this is a bit of it's a bit of a buzz theme at the moment.
Yeah, well, I suppose it is this search for a sustainable future. And I know it's a cliche, but the most environmentally friendly building is the one that's already constructed. But it sort of goes further than sustainability, really, because there is this sort of postmodern pluralistic future that we're all pursuing, and that those ideas of heritage and use and evolution all combined within an environment that already exists allows the architect, the designer, the occupier to look at things in the past, but also to provide an environment for the future as well. And so it's all these things combined together. And those three tenets of sustainability, it isn't just environmental, but there's also community aspects. It's well recognised how mental health is improved by being part of a community. And if people can stay where they are and they can occupy a space they know and they recognise and they feel part of, It's definitely more healthy, and that's what we're all sort of pursuing at the moment, that sense of belonging to somewhere and to something and with people.
And it's, I suppose, one of the stories that's writ large across Manchester itself is this kind of tension between the erasure, the modernist erasure mentality, which it still adopts quite a lot, and then this wonderful heritage that it tries to maintain in the face of that kind of developer-led, local authority-led kind of erasure. So it's kind of an obvious thing for Manchester, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Cottonopolis, as it was known at the height of the Industrial Revolution, and there was 120 mills scattered across what is really quite a small city centre for such a big metropolis, really. So, but that sort of idea that Manchester is a brick city is quite interesting, and it's sort of what it's built from and what it's built and who built it all sort of can contribute towards a more interesting future, really.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. It is more interesting. Like it can't all end up looking like Battersea or the City of London or Ian Simpsonville, can it?
Well, yes, absolutely. There is that sense that individualism is. We're living in the age of the individual. So that's sort of that search for individualism, whether that's a person or a community or a city, is actually really important. And to be distinct is part of the future, really, and we all want to be distinct, so it's an opportunity if you do retain the buildings, but it isn't just the buildings you retain the street patterns, and you retain the sort of the sense of connection with the geology and the geography and the climate. I mean, buildings evolve in places. There are many reasons for it, and it's the climate is massively influential because that has dictated what people do in that area and how they build those buildings. And even the way they speak is directly connected to it. So that sense of retaining that and not just becoming sort of one of many places that all look the same.
That you touched on that thing, which I am kind of searching for an answer around this, so that idea of adaptive reuse at the scale of the city, because I understand it in terms of the scale of the building. I was talking to Dr. Ruth Lang from the Royal College of Art and May Architects, who's now also working for the Design Museum and something else, as one of the School of Architecture, something like that. Anyway, and she's written this great book on adaptive reuse, beautifully illustrated book, really nice projects, nice discussions in it. But I'm still not entirely sort of conscious or like understand quite how city making could work on this adaptive reuse. But I suppose this idea of climate and this idea of urban layout as being somehow inherent to a place might be a mechanism for kind of doing it.
Yeah, because the idea of adaptive reuse, it comes at many scales.
Yeah.
From the sort of intimate scale of something very small, a chair, a table, a piece of furniture, through the buildings to the sort of the built environment, and as bigger scale built environment. And I think there are two words here. There's adaptation or adaptive, and there is reuse. So you can reuse certain aspects of it, but there is that sense of things being adapted as well, and adapted to the sort of the needs and the desires of the population of the 21st century. Yeah. And on a more urban scale, this might mean adding new buildings. It might mean extending existing structures, and it might mean that sort of that sense of it's much greater than just adapting individual buildings. It's that sense of how it belongs to that whole greater culture. Mm-hmm. And but it's also one of the things about adaptive reuse is that it has its sort of basis in contextualism. And contextualism is that sense of understanding what's there and using it to help develop the future. And this doesn't mean pastiche or, adopting the vernacular. It's using 21st century technology and for 21st century people, but making it appropriate. And it's about the scale of that. And the approach might be the same, whether it's a really tiny thing or a great big urban sprawl. The approach might be the same. It's just the scale of it is a different size.
Well, that was a deviation from the planned programming, but lovely, and thank you very much for that. But
it's not. It's sort of a deviation.
I was hoping you would come up with a decent segue, a really elegant segue. So we're talking about inside information, the defining concepts of interior design, which you wrote with Ed Hollis and was published by Reba when, this year or last year? This year, wasn't it?
This year, yeah.
And it was another very attractively produced and beautifully written book. So this segue, so adaptive reuse. So how does someone who is interested in adaptive reuse, why does someone who's interested in adaptive reuse write a book on interior design?
I suppose
obviously you're allowed to be interested in more than two things, but yes. I'll permit you that. But
yeah, thank you. It is, but there is that sense of this. If I should introduce Ed as well, because Ed Hollis and I go back years and years. I was the external examiner on. He teaches in Edinburgh on the MA Interiors programme. And I was his external examiner, and we started having conversations about many years ago about what is an interior and what does it mean, and the sort of interiors are everywhere. And he's written a couple of books, The Memory Palace and The Secret Lives of Buildings, which discuss this quite a lot. And over the years, Ed and I have kept in contact, and we started to develop this idea of a lexicon. Not a dictionary, not an encyclopedia, but a lexicon. And there's something really charming about lexicons, because they are not definitions, they're not narratives, but they're stories. Lexicon tells a story, and they're usually in alphabetical order and a series of descriptions or stories. Now, the thing about an encyclopedia is that they're almost obsolete before they're even written, because things are changing so fast, and the meanings of things are changing fast, and information is a really sort of slippery thing. If you have a smartphone, Ambrose, your smartphone has access to more information than you'll find in the British Library. I mean, that little block is incredible. But it's how you contextualize that. And stories put facts into focus, really. And that's the whole point about them. They're not stories. Allow experiences, allow facts, allow things to be put into context. And they also cross discipline, and they bring in many factors. And that's the whole thing about the interior, is we're surrounded by interiors. We spend most of our life in interiors, and the definition of the interior is a rapidly changing thing as well. So this book tries to not so much define interiors, but put into context different qualities of them. So the way it was developed is that after a number of conversations, Ed and I actually decided we were going to write it. So we had 2 days of brainstorming where he knows a lot of stuff, and I've written quite a few books. So between us, we knew quite a lot of stuff. And we brainstormed for 2 days what it was for interior, what interiors meant. And we came up with several hundred little tippy-tabby notes with the whole of the definitions in. And then we said, we're going to put these into 26 different categories. And then each of them is then fronted by a letter. So this inside information is an A to Z of what an interior is. When we first went to the RIBA and sort of discussed this book, they said, "Oh, that's very nice having it in order A to Z. But what happens when it gets translated? Then you're going to lose that." So we realised that actually you might, although within this book it is an A to Z, they're not in that order. Which is something very nice as well in the end, really, because again, it's about stories. Stories make you think. Stories help to portray morals. Stories talk about facts and explain why those facts came about. So we've got 26 stories about interiors, really, from when we start with anti, as in anti-room and antecedent, and end in zeitgeist, but there's an awful lot in
there
between.
is an awful lot, and as I said, lovely images too. But this idea of the interior as a distinct thing, which you've touched on, I think is really fascinating, as a thing that is distinct. So obviously you teach in an architecture school, and this is more or less an architecture podcast. And interior design on some levels is somewhat treated like the poor cousin.
Yeah, I think that's ever so interesting why that has happened.
But it's true, isn't it? I'm not being prejudiced here. This is not just me thinks that.
No, I completely agree. And one of the things about this book is it is trying to reclaim it in a way. And I think there's a number of reasons why within the architectural profession, interiors is treated as, how did you call it?
Poor cousin.
Poor cousin or inferior.
Yeah.
Cousin, as in inferior design. Interior design is always the little rhyme that is used. But I think there's two reasons. One of them goes back to really the turn of the 19th, 20th century. And before that, interior design, as it was practiced, how you would dress the interior, was done by the upholsterer. And the upholsterer and the architect would work together. And the upholsterer was a professional. And about that time, interior design, or the practice of interior design, became a respectable pursuit for middle-class women. So it changed from being the men doing it to women doing it. They could do it. There's sort of middle-class women who had to work. They may become governesses, or they could become interior designers. And so immediately within society, it was women doing it who were regarded as second-class citizens quite a lot. So then you've got that, and then that is combined with this sort of modernist idea that the interior is little more than the result of the exterior walls, which somebody might come in and dress afterwards, but really the quality of the interior is made by those, the sense of where the architect has placed the exterior walls. That is combined with this sort of modernist idea of slippery space and windows that allow great views, and that ambiguity between inside and outside, as epitomized by something like the Barcelona Pavilion, where there was, when are you actually in the building and when do you leave the building? That's sort of the ambiguity, and that is absolutely massive. So it becomes a profession that's practiced by women who come in maybe and dress something afterwards, and actually it is little more than the dictates of the architect. So it lost a huge amount of status. And before that, the interior would be an incredibly important element within the design of a building. And the architect would spend as long on the interior as the exterior, because that's sort of the enfilade of rooms or the position of spaces or the relationship of the windows to the exterior and those interior spaces and how it was decorated and those great mouldings and all that sort of qualities of that were regarded as important. So really, the 20th century did for the interior. But I think we're in a position now where we're beginning to reassess that. And that's not just to do with adaptive reuse and the importance of adaptive reuse within the search for a sustainable future, but also that idea that architects are that interest that architects have in the intimacy and of the design process.
Interesting, this idea of, it was something that the second podcast I recorded with Kathleen James Chakraborty at UC Dublin about her work around the Bauhaus, was that, I mean, the Bauhaus had actually taken on more women than men, but most of them had gone into areas around interior design, fabric design. Few of them, and a few of them had been included in the general architectural and high art side of it. And they were kind of erased from the story on purpose by Gropius and Mies and was it Kandinsky as well. Their story wasn't relevant, but Kathleen's point is that actually they became much more potent because they went out into the world of things like publishing, but also into things like interior design. And the effect of their work was much more instrumental on the lives of ordinary people than high architecture ever could have been, insofar as that sort of diffusion, that dissemination of ways of dressing the interior of homes, which is most people's experience of architecture. You know, it's most people, it's an enormous trade. Like DIY is like in Britain, it's like billions and billions of pounds a year. And actually it was through this that these women came to be. So I think this issue, this is another very interesting idea around the problematic that is modern architecture, which we're all sort of trying to unpack it still. And I think it's, again, to go back to what you were talking about with regards adaptive reuse.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, that, isn't it? It's a little bit like Beatrice Colomina talks about Mies van der Rohe as a self-publicist.
Mm-hmm.
And he did incredibly well out of the amount of self-promotion that he put about. And maybe you look at, for instance, the fitted kitchen. The women who actually developed that were completely eclipsed by the men who then publicized it. And so there's sort of these, and it's the same with the Bauhaus, isn't it? Maybe some people have bigger voices and louder, or maybe they're given more opportunities to.
I did note that a certain school of architecture had a certain very famous architect come and give a big lecture recently, and I don't know. We sort of invite this on ourselves, don't we? As a profession and as a trade, we actually invite this. Like, yes, they're self-promoting because we want to promote them. There's something weird. There's a kind of weird tension in between the two. Like, if architecture schools stopped giving platforms and such adulation to these ridiculous characters, maybe we would have less ridiculous characters. I don't know.
Yes, he was one of many visitors this year, but some do get more publicity than others. Yeah,
but it's just the nature of the photographs. I mean, the photographs are of that heroic, the publicity photographs of the heroic archetype. It's like Ayn Rand actually won. Like the fountainhead is the model. But anyway, that's how.
Yeah, but it is also part of our celebrity culture, isn't it? And that pursuit of celebrity and that sort of, again, which then goes back to the rise in the importance of the individual.
Yeah.
So we're not all working towards a common cause. We're all individuals pursuing some aspect of our lives and wanting that.
Yeah. Back on track. So one of the things I thought that jumped out at me was this: you mention a number of times issues around writing and the novel, I think, and a kind of relationship. And I wonder whether and then you've written this lexicon, this lovely book, from the perspective of stories. And I wondered if there was some connection there between the way that you conceptualize interiors and the way that this book naturally emerged, and whether if you had been writing about architecture, you would have ever considered writing about stories. Like novels particularly are set in interiors. That's kind of what they do. They're like, particularly the early novel, is like looking inside people's drawing rooms, and there's something about the story, like the narrative story, the female designer, the novel. I wonder if there's a connection there, and that naturally, when one wants to try and discuss domesticity or interiority, you're drawn towards narrative, because sort of that's the way we conceptualize it. That's the way we understand it. That's the way we discuss it. That's the way we communicate it. I've been struggling recently. I was writing something about homes. I was doing a research project around homes, and I was trying to find good writing on homes. And there's almost nothing. Like, there's lots of books on houses. There's one or two books in which people wax lyrical in a kind of phenomenological sense about the essence of home. But actually describing homes, I mean, there's one or two. But mainly, if you want to find out about homes, you read novels.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I hope you've read the chapter in this book on home.
I haven't read that one. No, go on. Tell me.
Well, that could be a good starting point, because it is quite interesting, and I think home is a really good example of this idea of storytelling.
Yeah.
Because it encompasses sort of the evolution of the home and how we move from that sort of idea of a community and everybody living together to the rise in the 20th century of the individual and the terraced house, and talks about the evolution of the corridor, and that idea that the way we occupy homes is rapidly changing now. And we have ideas of community living, mixed generational living, all those sort of things. So we've gone from an idea of community homes where everybody's sort of clustered around the open fire in the centre of the room, and then to the farmhouse around the big farm table, the kitchen table, and everybody doing individual things, to moving into individual rooms. But then we're now moving back to this idea of clustering around in an individual in a collective space. But included within that idea of the home, you have the idea of stories about women's position in the home, because it's Penny Spark talks about the idea that during the modernist period, when women were expected to stay at home, they were homemakers, and the man almost became a visitor in his own home. And he'd come back, and the other older male members of the family, they would come home and they would be served their dinner from this room tucked away at the back, where all this magical food and things came round, and there was no sense of the interaction between the two. Well, now the kitchen has moved from the outrigger at the back of the house to the centre ground of the house. And that's where you could have kitchen suppers, where if people come around for dinner, everybody congregates around there, where the kids might be sitting doing their homework while some parent or older adult will cook the dinner for them. So has moved from the periphery to the main place of interaction within a house or within a home itself. And then within that story of the home, you have things like the position of furniture, which up until the 18th century was movable, and furniture was moved around the room depending on what was going on in the house at the time. And the rooms themselves had quite often had no fixed use to them. So they might be one thing at one point of the day, one thing at something else during the day. Not like today, we have a sitting room, we have a kitchen, we have a home office, we have a living room, we have a study, we have bedrooms. There was that sort of real ambiguity to it.
Which must have meant that homes could actually be a little bit smaller as well.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And central heating means that we can occupy all of the house comfortably. But although the fuel crisis at the moment means that we're all starting to congregate in the same room again, but also digital interaction has meant that as well. So someone, you could sit with your kids in the same room, and they'll be on some sort of computer with their earphones in, and they have privacy with what they're doing, and you can have privacy with what you're doing. I mean, it's what Shelley Turkle calls alone together. And
who is that? Who calls it that?
Shelley Turkle.
So this makes sense of this kind of this thing that I picked out in the provocations that I sent to you, which is this idea of you write, interior is a sensibility, a way of doing things rather than a thing in and of itself. So this is this idea of I would just like you to unpack that a little bit, I suppose.
Yeah, I think what's quite interesting about interiors and interior is that it's a noun and it's an adjective, but it's not a verb. So you can see an interior, you can inhabit an interior, you have an interior world within you, you're in the interior of a continent.
Yeah.
Or you can practice interior design or interior decoration. But you can't, it's not a verb. You can't do an interior. I interior, you interior, we all interior. It's not a verb. And I think that's really quite sort of interesting. So, sorry, what was your question?
Well, no, it's just this idea of the diffusion of you say interiority is a sensibility. I mean, suppose what you're talking about there, by the way, I guess, is like this idea of housing as a verb, the John Turner housing as a verb. But interior as a verb is not really, doesn't kind of work in the same way, does it? But this idea of, you write, interior is a sensibility, a way of doing things rather than the thing in and of itself. And I said, to people like me, this idea of the interior being everywhere, what the hell does that mean? Like what becomes of boundaries? How do I keep people out? Like that's a really major thing, particularly in increasingly crowded places. The idea of having an interior, a threshold you step over, that is yours and yours alone, that you can escape people in, is very lovely. But this idea, as you described, you could sit with your children in the wherever it is, and they can be in a private world, but actually they're right beside you. They can't escape you. Isn't this idea of the interior being a way of being rather than an actual thing problematic?
That's that's a really interesting idea, but I don't understand why it's a problem, really. I think there's something very nice about the idea that as human beings are people who we are a community-based species, really. We like being with each other. We enjoy each other's company for most of the time. And therefore, I mean, there's nothing nicer than sitting with your children, but not actually necessarily having to interact with them all of the time and them being able to get on. But that sort of sense of living together in a communal way, which encourages a sort of,
yeah, I don't know, but you see, the thing is if you can take interiority, right, and you can say it's about being in your own personal world, stuck in your electronic device, therefore you can take your personal space out into the world, therefore we don't have to, you will own nothing and you will be happy. You will be able to drift, this breaking down. So this is like hyper-modernist, actually. This is like the zenith of modernist thinking, is that there is no boundary. There is only amorphous interior space. Interiority is you thinking on your own. That's all it is. Mm-hmm. So I'm quite interested in this idea, like, because I really like thresholds. I think that they're like spatial grammar. They allow you to know when something is changing, when meaning is changing, so that you can modify your behavior or not in relation to it. Like it's elegant. So I'm just kind of like challenged by this idea of interiors being diffuse and everywhere.
Yeah, but that is just one of the. There are a number of different stories and arguments within the book, because you can have interiors everywhere because of that sort of sense of interiority within yourself. But also, it is a sort of a plea for a return to that sense of interiors within buildings, and the idea that, I mean, Venturi talks a lot about that in Complexity and Contradiction, and although that was, a long time ago now, but he has a sort of a plea for the idea that the interior and the exterior can be different. And they don't have, and the architecture as sort of the building, rather, as a mediator between the interior and the exterior. And so that the building is a container for something, and the interior then having an identity. And that identity changes depending on who's occupying it, depending on what the use is. And to go back to this idea of how you represent interiors, what's also quite interesting is that the history of interiors is incredibly scarce because they're rarely preserved. Buildings are updated, they're changed, and yet and the walls might stay there, but how it was occupied and what that space looked like is continually evolving. So this idea, your plea for an interior with a threshold, where, and indeed that is what the threshold is for. It's sort of more than an opening in a wall. It is a point to modify your behaviour, to collect your thoughts, to make that transition, whether that's between rooms within a building or between the inside and the outside, or the outside and the inside. It is that sort of moment to do that and enter a different space and a different quality of space.
You talk also about the role of the interior, which again sounds, as I put in my notes, sounds madly, ludicrously broad. What is the role of the interior? And you document various things in the book.
Yeah,
particularly nice one around the office cubicle, I thought was particularly good. I love the idea of an office cubicle, but commons and things like that.
Yeah, well, I suppose that's it. That's the whole point with the stories. Yeah. So, for instance, commons was that idea of space, commercial space such as shopping centres, like arcades. It talks about sort of how the evolution of the arcade. What's really interesting about the arcade is that when it's a covered street, basically, and a covered street containing shops, maybe offices, boutiques, dressmakers, things like that. But the arcade, which actually developed in France before it came to England, but there was a war going on, so the English didn't see it at the time for a long time. But that couldn't develop until drainage was sorted. So if a time when sewage and effluent was just thrown into the street, to have that street covered developed a completely uninhabitable space. So as soon as they really started to rise in popularity and the ability to occupy them, as soon as drains were installed. So get rid of the drainage, get rid of all the effluent, and then you can have a covered street. But before that, it was absolutely impossible. And there may have been covered courtyards, but you got an awful lot of fresh air with an arcade around a courtyard. But so that this idea of a shopping centre, which comes from an arcade, which comes from sort of an exchange before that, couldn't evolve until certain other things had happened within the sort of the evolution of the built environment.
That's an interesting idea, that technology sort of has driven the shift in interior architecture, not only social mores, because you talked about that earlier, this idea of the homemaker, the housewife, and the way that then interior design modifies in relation to that. But this idea also that technology, infrastructural technology becomes not just like white goods, but infrastructural technology becomes instrumental in the way that interiors form and are, I suppose, conceived of, because the arcade then transforms the identity of the city street as well, doesn't it? You create essentially a policed environment for shopping, and that bleeds out into the wider street pattern around it.
Yeah. I mean, the other really interesting thing about arcades, and this is Jane Rendell talks about this quite a lot, is the idea that, again, these become environments that women could go to and on their own. And so when they first start to develop, you get arcades, they contained tea houses, they get dressmakers, boutiques, hairdressers, a lot of things like that respectable women didn't have to be accompanied to go to. They could go, they could visit on their own. And each of the buildings within an arcade generally is made up of a number of buildings, each with their own front door. And women, in a way, as they occupied them, they became, there was an extension to where women became the goods on sale as well. So upstairs within some of these arcades might be dressmakers, might be hat makers, things like that, where there are intimate examinations of women if you're being measured for a new frock or new shoes or something like that. But it also encouraged prostitution because the women themselves became the objects on display. Oh, so it's this sense of how these stories, you might start with this idea of commons and how a great mall or shopping centre, but if you understand where it came from and why it evolved, then it's a sort of a nice sense of continuum within that.
Is there? I mean, this sounds like a pretty dumb question, but is the story of the interior this very much a story of women? Is it like what I'm not trying to say is like, oh, interior designers are like middle class ladies, but I'm just interested in this idea of the interior as being a space that has enabled an emancipation or an enfranchisement of women, and as a consequence, it's become the space in which they become most active as designers as well. Is there any sense of that? Does the data show that, or is there any kind of?
No, it's an interesting idea, and I possibly I've led the conversation in that way, but it isn't necessarily like that. But as a pursuit for women and in places that women could occupy, it's a really interesting idea because a lot of women didn't go into architecture. Architecture was a male preserve. And last year was the first year that there were more female architecture students than there were male went into the first year of the architecture school schools in the whole of the UK. Yeah. That isn't just in my school of architecture, across the whole UK, more females than males went into the first year of the education. So a generation ago, I mean, when I was at architecture school, when I was at university, there was one girl studying architecture. And now more than half of the students are female. So that idea of architecture as a profession just for the preserve of men has changed. I mean, and just for the preserve of white men has massively changed as well, because it's incredibly diverse, not just by gender. So it possibly is that the interior and interior design decoration has traditionally been the preserve of women, but that is changing as well. Just as more women are coming into architecture, more men are practicing interiors as well. So it is an interesting idea as well. And,
go on. Sorry,
it's a bit like those. There are Caspar Friedrich David did those fantastic paintings. One of the back of a man on the top of a mountain, and he's sort of heroically looking over a massive landscape. And about the same time, he did a photograph of painting of the back of a woman looking through a window. and she's sort of contained within this cage of the interior, looking out, but unable to get out. And the two epitomised what was going on in society at the time, as the interior does. But now you sort of think, if you painted that now, what would it be like? It would be radically different.
I assume so.
You would hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to finish up with this issue around education. Like, what is the role of in architectural education? You're right, we design objects in space. If we're lucky, we design urban plans. So that's urban design, and then there's architectural design. So whatever urban design is, master planning, and then there's building design, and then there's this thing that we don't really do. We might do some kind of renders, some generic renders of an interior to give a sense of place, whatever that is, but we don't actually do much interior design, do we? And it's quite an interesting one, because it's at the scale of the interior that the human body becomes meaningful in relation to architecture. It's how humans interact with architecture. It's not as, from a God's eye view, it's not as objects. Yet we don't really teach it, or at least in the experiences that I've had, it's not been something that we've talked about much. And I wondered if you had any particular insight into how, because you are both an architect and an interior designer, aren't you?
I'm not an architect.
You're not an architect.
I lecture in a school of architecture and I teach architecture, but I am not an architect. No.
I see.
No.
So
I've got a master's in interior design and a degree in furniture design.
So, where did you do the furniture design? Just
in Manchester.
Did you at the School of Art in Manchester?
Yeah, Manchester School of Art. Yeah.
So how do you then? So you're even better for this, because then you've not been infected too much by architectural education.
I have taught it for 30 years.
Yeah, so by symbiosis, but not by application.
No, I think it's quite interesting, and I think one of the things that has changed a lot of architects' attitudes towards the interior is the practice of adaptive reuse.
Okay.
Because with adaptive reuse, every building is individual, every building is different, and therefore that understanding of context of place, of materials that has to happen with adaptive reuse means that architects are engaged not just with the building and not just with the alterations to that building, whether that's extensions or massive amount of interior alterations or a bit of both, which means that architects have to engage with the intimate qualities of the building, interior and exterior, to make it work, because you can't have tolerances of I remember we had Branson Coates come in and talked about the music centre they designed in Sheffield, which are these two great massive drums, four massive drums, and they had tolerances of 10 centimetres on that, which is just like, that just blows your mind, that degree of tolerances. With adaptive reuse, you can't do that. You have to understand what every elevation looks like, what every floor finish is, where one piece of material touches another piece of material. And it's a completely different way of thinking about architecture. So that there is a real sort of slipping between what is interior design and what is architecture design. And that happens through adaptive reuse. And that's sort of until maybe 20 years ago. When I wrote my first book, it was actually fairly difficult to find really good examples of adaptive reuse. Now you sort of, every day something comes in from the Architects Journal or the RIBA Journal or somewhere, or Design or something like that, with another really nice example of this sort of practice. But it's really based on an understanding of place over program. So that you have to understand the building, you have to understand the place, you have to understand the materials, which means that you're not drawing things at 1 to 100. These drawings have to be done at 1 to 1, 1 to 5, and understanding the materials and how they're used and how people interact with them. So I think there's a real blurring between interiors and architecture that's happening really at the moment. And I think that's a really healthy thing, really.
That's a really interesting and, dare I say it, quite controversial idea of putting place over program, because there's been a drift in architectural education, certainly, and just generally, I think, to foreground program as the be all and end all. And perhaps it's been as a consequence of that we've seen such kind of mad erasure, well, such crap buildings, a lot of very bad architecture, by heroic architects, no less. But also that kind of erasure, because if you emphasize the programmatic worth of your project, you don't have to consider the material reality of it.
No, I completely agree. And it turns that sort of aphorism, form follows function, it completely turns it on its head.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes form follows form.
Mm-hmm.
And with an adaptive reuse project, with an interior project, the form of the design, the resultant design, has to be based on the form of what's there already. Unless it becomes a sort of gratuitously flamboyant juxtaposition of a project. And most of those, are not generally that good. But the sort of the beautiful projects that you see being developed all the time now, that sort of form follows form.
Yeah.
That prioritization of place over program is I think becoming the prevalent attitude within interiors and architecture. So it's sort of this idea of the existing built fabric as a sort of palimpsest to be read, rather than sort of rather than it's the existing being a monument that you preserve. It's a palimpsest that's read and changed and a part of an evolution, really. And that's the idea of being part of an evolution is something that Sheila O'Donnell talks about. That lovely project that they did quite early, the Irish Film Centre, which was just an absolute jewel set into the heart of a city block in Dublin, was maybe 10, 15 years after they did it, was converted into an Irish pub. And it was just like your heart sank. And she was very, very philosophical. She says it's just part of the evolution of the built environment. So it's...
Other than the Irish Film Centre, do you have... I would really like to know if there's like an example of really good adaptive reuse interior that listeners could look at, that I could link to.
All right. Well, considered the absolute master of adaptive reuse is Carlo Scarpa.
I knew you were going to say it.
Yeah, well, you have to say him because he is the big daddy, really, of the subject. So that's well, all right. We won't say that. You have
no. That's legitimate. I mean, Carlo Scarpa is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, and that epitomises this idea of place over function. It's very much born of place, and that sort of complete connection with what was there. But what I think is very interesting about Scarpa is that idea of the scraping away, the patina of time and that sort of history. And we've slightly moved on from that now. And there are other aspects. Patina of time and history is one aspect of adaptive reuse, but I think that idea of it combined with issues of sustainability and the search for a carbon neutral future have really sort of cemented it as the way forward. Yeah,
really wonderful. Thank you so very much, Sally. That was really delightful.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I've enjoyed it very much.
Shut the front door. That was awesome. Thank you to Sally for taking the time to speak with me and for the great book. Thanks to Reba Books too for sending me the hard copy. It was delightful. Please Please see the podcast description for links to Sally's professional and social media stuff, and of course, for links to the book. And don't forget to like, subscribe, follow and share Ears for Architecture all over everything. And thanks for listening to the 50th episode of this very strange project. Cheers.